tough timing amid the current pressure on some of the companies. What do you make of this questioning?
Yeah, so, importantly, the reason we launched this fund is we believe this is the most profound technology shift that we will see in our lifetimes. So whatever happens over the next couple of months is going to happen, but the direction of travel over the next 20 years, we think is very positive as it relates to AI. And if we just, reflect back over the last 25 years and the cloud, the social and the mobile boom, that was, 20 plus years of value creation. And, we think AI has the potential to be even larger than that.
Right.
And with that, given, your question on valuations, it depends, there are clearly pockets of the market where things are more speculative and very highly valued. So, you talked about Palantir, for example, as a good example of a company that trades at a very elevated multiple. Great company, great fundamentals, extremely high valuation. And then, you can come back to names like Taiwan Semiconductor or, that trades at a teens earnings multiple, or, Nvidia that still trades at a reasonable multiple given its earnings growth rate with really powerful secular trends. And you can get more comfortable in areas like that. And so, our whole goal also, just to put a finer point on this, is, AI is going to affect the entire economy. So the purpose of our fund is it's going to be heavy with tech, as you can see, in terms of the top holdings, but also you'll find, names in financial services, consumer, healthcare, industrial, and other areas of the economy as well.
It's about where you think AI is going to enable, enhance, or benefit. So I'm interested by the fact that you've got Eaton in there, Blackstone, we're thinking real estate, we're thinking power. How much has that not been priced into these sorts of companies yet, Denny?
Well, I think if we're looking, at the next, 5 to 10 years, you can make a case for, the companies that, we've populated in the portfolio right out of the gate. And you mentioned power. It's probably the single biggest constraint to deploying data centers right now at the scale that we need and the density that we need is getting, power available. And then once you can get the power available, then you have to cool the data centers. And there's an entire ecosystem around that that specializes in, in those dynamics. And, clearly we want to participate in that, over the longer term.
What's really interesting is about the application of AI. So yes, it's about the infrastructure that goes in and the power that we talk about, the real estate, but then it's actually what it does for businesses. You talk about financials, you talk about healthcare. What do you make of this MIT research report that everyone seems to be worrying about, the fact that 95% of all pilots fail?
Well, we're in that phase right now. And, I was in the Valley during the dawn of the commercial internet, and there were a lot of failures at that point in time too. And, during that period, we had a boom, we had a bust, and, and then it actually created some of the most powerful companies on the planet today, and, laid the foundation for, these multi-year trends. And so I think kind of depends what you're doing. There are clear applications out there. Clearly people are getting, value out of things like ChatGPT, deep research, co-pilots being widely deployed. And then you have a lot of experimental stuff that's going on in companies, and it's the nature of the beast that, you're generally gonna, fail a little bit out of the gate, and you learn from that. The technology gets better. People get sharper in terms of deploying the technology and figuring out how to use it, how to change their behaviors.
Yes.
And then you look back in, 3 or 5 years, and you're like, wow, I kind of, missed the forest for the trees.
Denny, what's interesting, you referenced the dot-com era. Just recently, Intel was back at a profit in terms of its price versus future profit. Its valuation was akin to the dot-com era. It was so high. What do you make of SoftBank putting in money? I know that's in the latest fund, and also the government.
Yeah, so, Intel's an interesting one on the valuation. The reason the multiple's so high is because earnings have absolutely collapsed.
Yes.
And so, that PE equation, when the E goes a lot lower, the PE goes up a lot. So not necessarily because the market's been enthusiastic about Intel, but rather, the financial performance of the company. And then, I just think, SoftBank investing in Intel, it's a little bit curious, potentially, or particularly given that, they have their ownership in ARM, they're participating in Stargate, they bought Ampere. So, it almost feels like a little bit of a hedge just because we're going to be undersupplied with semiconductor content for years, it feels like. And, that and power are very significant constraints. And I think if you just kind of look at the behaviors we've seen so far and some of the assets that SoftBank's selling down, kind of feels like they're selling down some of their traditional holdings that they've had in things like, T-Mobile, for example, and they're redeploying that into AI infrastructure. And then the U.S. government, I just don't know because, there's a reason Taiwan Semiconductor has done as well as they've done. They've had leadership now for a decade. Their competencies are just, much more pronounced than Intel. Intel's been in a hole for a long time. Pat Gelsinger gave it a shot for, almost 5 years. We have a lot of respect for Lip-Bu Tan. We invested with him at Cadence Design for years, exceptional leader. But, Intel's not going to get fixed overnight, and there's nothing the government can do to change the disparity between Intel's process technology and Taiwan Semiconductor.